I'll concede your point just for brevity. But
What? Brevity? We don't do that around here. It's probably
No.
Citrus, or what is a Capital One Bowl? It used to be Citrus Bowl, right?
oh my
Capital
God,
One.
dude, where have you been?
I just like the real name.
It hasn't been the Citrus Bowl since like what 2002?
What was your highlight side dish from Thanksgiving?
Oh gosh, Scotch.
This is the Buck Around, the podcast devoted to all things Wisconsin Badger football from a fan perspective. Featuring your hosts, Richard Branch and Maxwell Brusky.
And hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Buck Around. Welcome back to episode 304 of the Buck Around. I am one half of said Buck Around, Richard Branch, and I am joined by my inquisitive colleague, Maxwell Brusky. Max, how are you, sir?
I'm good.
Yeah,
Definitely inquisitive.
You are, so
Yeah.
we were kind of going over a little bit before we hit the red button about what we were going to talk about today. Your brow was the most furrowed brow I have ever seen. And you have a cornucopia of furrowed brows, if I may say.
That's true.
Like
That's
they
true.
are, there is like the I'm not agreeing with you furrowed brow. There is the I'm trying to understand what this weird guy I do a podcast with is talking about furrowed brow. There is the I'm really annoyed furrowed brow. This was a different one. This was like I was ready for the smoke to start coming out from behind those headphones. The brain cells
This whole
were working.
project just got me going.
Yeah, so we are back, and it is February, and this is normally, back in the old days, I think we've said this enough, when we'd be talking about National Signing Day, as it's rapidly approaching for the old one.
It's hard to believe, isn't it?
Right? And it doesn't
It's-
even
yeah,
register.
It's like tomorrow.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it is. I was like, it's soon. Oh, no, it's tomorrow, and it doesn't even matter.
And just since we're talking about it, there's no one that's going to wind up like Wisconsin's not a player for anybody that's going to sign tomorrow.
No.
Are they?
No.
I mean, not that I'm aware of.
Unless it's totally under the radar.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I just want to make sure that
Yeah.
that I haven't missed anything.
And it's totally cool. I mean, half the class is already enrolled in school and doing winter conditioning. I'm seeing them on the social media feeds.
That's true.
But so, yeah, we had a little project this week we wanted to talk about. And it was inspired, I'm going to freely let you know it, because the whole H-Bomber guy plagiarism thing that I've seen going around on YouTube. It has been inspired by a tweet from our friend, Prop Bet Andy, who put out, like a week ago, I want to say. It was January 31st. So yeah, almost a week ago to the day, pointing out that I want to cite him properly here. He said, assuming, because this was the big news we heard last week, that Owen Strebig, or Strebig, however you say his last name, is now a very heavy Notre Dame lean and will be committing within the next 2 days, or announcing his commitment in the next couple of days, that he will likely be leaving Wisconsin and going to Notre Dame. That's sort of what fueled this conversation. But as Mr. Schaff pointed out, he said, if that does happen, that means 9 of the last composite 4-star in-state recruits have gone out of state. And it's different and it's new. And that hasn't happened a lot. And the conversation, it got me thinking, like, well, how different is this? And how new is this? And, is that truly valid? And is that something that's going on? And is it something we should be worried about as Badger fans? Does it represent a change? All these kinds of things. And what does it mean? Does it mean, we should be #oopsing it? Should we go full Tom Oates? Or does it mean something else? Or really, like, let's go into this thing with an open mind and find out what's going on. So I started poking around a history.
Wait.
Yeah.
Was there a #oops?
No, but I think that's sort of like we're memifying the whole thing.
Okay.
You know what I
Alright,
mean?
Okay. Yeah, sure.
But thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, no. I did want to clarify. I don't know if there was during the Donovan Harbour, Corey Smith, but
There wasn't a hashtag.
what's the other Garrett Sexton?
Yeah,
saga?
no, there wasn't
Nathan
a
Roy.
hashtag. It was
Okay.
just an oops. I think with a period at the end of it.
Yeah. Was there a oops tweet for those?
Oh, 100%
Oh, there was,
for
huh?
back for those there was, for sure. I mean,
Yeah.
don't get me too caught up in the specifics of which ones, but I think there were 3.
Well,
A
no,
and then we got one this year, by the
yeah,
way.
and I think it is a point though, because this has been a topic of conversation throughout the Fickle era. So
Well, this has been an
yeah, not
exciting
not not just Owen Streebig and James Flanagan.
Yes, this has been an exciting time for people to freak out about in-state recruiting, that's for certain. So, what you and I did, we pulled together a big chunk of data, basically going on to Rivals and 247. It's a combination of the two, which makes it a little tricky, but that's primarily because 24/7 Sports didn't really exist. I forget when it came into existence, like 2008, 2009.
It
But
sounds right.
a lot of what they used is I think was quite frankly like migrated Rivals stuff, because Rivals is the oldest of the services. And we went back to 2003. And the reason we picked that year was 2003 was the oldest year where the data didn't feel a little like, I don't know, it's getting a little weird back here, because those internet recruiting ranking era, really is, that's like the, what do we want to call that? I don't know, like the early days. That's like the mainframe computer era of the internet.
Well, it's when things switched from like just Tom Lemming
Right.
to Rival Scout, blah 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 blah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it exploded.
Right.
I shouldn't say just Tom Lemming, because there were. This is another another kind of Bill King throwback, because he and the people that he talks to, of that generation, there were a lot of people doing it, but I think you had to have like subscribe to newsletters.
Right.
You know,
It was
so I mean, there
printed.
were blogs probably in the mid to late 90s, but yeah, I think it's a complete. It was an explosion of
For sure.
with the internet. Yeah.
So that was the oldest we were willing to go before we started to think the data starts to get a little janky. And even then, honestly, getting back to 2003, 2004, 2005, you're like, clearly I think the term I used with you before we hit record was the grade inflation, if you will, starts to sort of kick in, because if you go way back there's a lot of guys who are like the 5th ranked player in the state of Wisconsin who are ranked like a low 2-star, like borderline 1-star. And you're like, okay,
The representative one would be future All-American Jack
Jack Ikeguani was a great example. And you're like, he's the 4th ranked guy in the state, and he's got a Michigan offer, but he's like a low 2-star. And you're like, all right.
His grade is 0.76.
Yeah.
It's a 76.
So that's a good one to sort of point out. So
Yeah.
we understand going in, like there's some stuff that's a little funky and it's hard to figure out and what it means. And I actually have a theory on what that means a little, we'll get to later, but just want to explain. So we created a database of every single known offer made by the Badgers to a player from the state of Wisconsin, starting in the year 2003 through 2025, current as of, I guess yesterday, Monday, February 5th. And it's every player who had a Wisconsin offer and then committed somewhere. So there are guys that aren't in this database yet, like Trey Poteet, right? He has a Wisconsin offer, but he has not committed somewhere. So he's not in our data presently.
Right.
But obviously before 2025 and before 2024, as of tomorrow, or 2024 and before as of tomorrow, that stuff's not going to change. That will be set to wax, as you like to say. We tracked where the player committed and signed their letter of intent. Nothing after that. But the big thing to remember, this doesn't include players Wisconsin didn't offer. So this isn't really measuring, well, did they do a good job of who they offered? That's not what we're trying to measure here. What we're just kind of looking at is, like, who did Wisconsin offer in the past? Did they stay? Did they go? So this isn't about, well, did they get Trey Waynes? Or did they get Will McDonald? And again, as I said to you before we hit record, the Will McDonald from 4 years ago, not the Will McDonald that's walking on to the Badgers this year. So for each one of these players that got an offer, we tracked the recruiting class that they were in, so the year they would have signed their letter of intent, their position, And for athletes, because we're only dealing with 155 guys, we put the position they ended up playing. So like a lot of guys who were athletes, like Austin Ramish was listed as an athlete, but he became a fullback within his first year. So, okay, he's a fullback. We tracked their 24/7 composite rating or their rivals rating, which most of the time was the same as the 24/7 composite if it was back, pre 247. Their recruiting ranking in the state. So if they were the number 1 recruit, the number 2 recruit, so on and so forth, where they committed, and by that it was a binary. Either did they go to Wisconsin or did they go somewhere else? What their interest level was nationally, and this is the one I explained to you beforehand, was were they a regional recruit? Were they offered by Wisconsin and Iowa and Minnesota and maybe some MAC schools? Or were they what we kind of arbitrarily dubbed a national recruit, which meant they got more than one blue blood offer? So did they get an Ohio State, a Michigan, and a USC offer? Or, an SEC offer from Florida and LSU, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I wouldn't say it's arbitrary. It's just more subjective.
Thank you. That's a better term.
Yeah.
And then the last thing, who the head coach was when they were offered. Just so we could say, do we see any patterns forming between coaches? And is there anything you could compare and contrast that says one is better or worse than the other? Because we set this criteria, like no matter what criteria we set, you are going to create a little bit of weirdness in here that you could maybe anecdotally account for, but we decided to not track anecdotally just because we don't know all the anecdotes. So it would just it would create a bias and an issue in the data. So there's guys like, as I said to you, which Max is going to wear the cone of shame because he does not remember this recruitment, but the Juan Harris recruitment, which is one of the all-time great recruitments in the history of recruiting, because even message board freaks were laughing at it. The ones who really get mad at everything. He was the guy that, if I remember correctly, committed to Wisconsin, decommitted from Wisconsin, committed and decommitted from Iowa 3 times, then committed to Indiana, decommitted, and then finally signed his letter of intent with Indiana in the end. He is considered a national recruit because he was offered early on by Ohio State and Michigan, and I'm willing to bet pretty quickly they kind of sniffed around and said, we're not willing to put up with this craziness, and moved on. But nonetheless, he fits that criteria. So he's a guy the Badgers moved on from quite clearly. Anecdotally, you'd say, oh, well, take that guy out. But there probably are some others if you go back in the past that we don't know about that we leave in. So it's kind of hard to scrub the data. There's other ones like Will Hagerup. Do you remember who that is?
Absolutely.
You do?
He was a star for Indiana.
Really? Okay.
First team All Big Ten.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and not only that, I know I'm 99% sure he did some kicking in the NFL. And I saw him on here as a kicker, and he started Indiana as a punter, if I'm not mistaken.
Interesting thing, a lot of he was a punter, wasn't he? I think he ended up, he was listed as a kicker, and I think a lot of them were all kicker. Like there were guys in there, like Brad Nortman is listed as a kicker.
Sure.
But he's a punter.
Sure.
But that's the year they took
he
Kyle
wasn't the
French.
only one.
Yeah, so they weren't going to give 2 scholarships out. So one of them was on the short end. So it's like, was it a miss? You don't know. But again, we can't do all that stuff anecdotally. And then the other one.
And by the same token, too, if you look at looking at this data, I mean, is it a miss if you whiff on a punter or a kicker and they succeed elsewhere? I don't know.
So again, and these are all fair questions. And then a guy like Tristan Pipp, which I had to do a little digging, was a guy who wanted to play baseball, who went to Central Michigan, had a Wisconsin offer. It looks like maybe they cooled on. You don't know. There's other guys like that who have Wisconsin offers, more than you'd think, who end up at MAC schools. Like 1 or 2 every few years. And you're like, I wonder what happened there. Like, how maybe it was an uncommittable offer. So we don't know all of that stuff, especially when you go back in the data. So we just said it's all got to stay.
That's a good aside. I had forgotten. I remember the name, and I remember that he went to a MAC school. I didn't remember which one, but I had forgotten about the baseball thing.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing he was a better baseball prospect than he was a football prospect.
Well, I Googled him after the
and,
facts.
and they don't have that at Wisconsin.
No. He was also off the football team, I think, before the following fall. So he just,
there you go.
we don't know. He was gone.
Sure. That's interesting.
So again, using all those conditions, this is a long lead in, everybody. Thank you for being patient, but we're dealing with a visual spreadsheet here and trying to, visual data and trying to do our best to communicate it.
And the spreadsheet will be available, of course.
Well, what we'll do is
if it's not already available.
It's on the Patreon. If you're a patron, you have a rough version of it. I'm going to put together a finished one. That'll be a little easier for people to read, that I kept playing with on my end a little bit too, because it's got a little bit, I made it a little bit more readable. So we'll put it on there, and after the episode, we'll make sure it's open so it's not paywalled, if people want to see it.
So the one thing on here too, just as a, precatory remark, or, before we get started, is for me, looking at this list, it is amazing of how many people, whether they went to UW or not, just simply didn't work out. I mean, it stands out. And I think, when we go through a recruiting exercise, a recruiting success exercise, and we wind up with, starter, role player washout. And it's like 50% of the washout. And then the other 50% is one of those other categories.
Right.
I mean, if you look at this list of all the guys they offered, I mean, even let's, even if you look at a class where they were rolling, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's look at 2011.
Yeah.
Right. Melvin Gordon, they won. He was committed to Iowa.
Right.
And then they flipped him eventually. Thank God. Best Badger ever. But like the rest of that class,
I know.
Jake Kiefer, who I remember being pretty excited about, Eric Steffes, Sam Arneson, Austin Molly. That's 3 tight ends.
I know.
And Arneson had, a pretty good Badger career, but I think he retired after his Badger career. Jordan Frederick.
Yeah, role player.
A good role. I mean, a decent role player, but yeah. Derek Watt.
Yep.
I mean, his name is Watt, still playing in the NFL, but I know he was he committed to Northwestern, I think, and he was a gray shirt or something like that. I mean, he wasn't nearly at the recruiting level of his brothers, even if he turned out to be a, one hell of a fullback for the Badgers, right? Derek Landish.
I know.
Who I think had a good Badger career, but not
a starter.
Not a star.
He started for a year.
Yeah. Fred Willis.
Washed out.
Complete washout. And I remember when he was on the field, I would be excited. Like, oh, there's some potential here. But nothing ever. And then Nate Hammond. Like you said, on this list of being probably the lowest rated recruit to be offered.
Yeah.
I mean, just on that list alone, and you think that's 2011. Like, that's like peak Bielema, and that's the success rate. So I think when you look over these and you're looking at just the whole spread of them, how many of them work out anyway? I mean, I think that just is a background of this whole project.
Well, the next logical step with it would be, because we were really just looking at ratings on this and like how well are they doing in terms of getting high level recruits. That's really sort of like the focus of it. It would be categorizing those guys by, again, the non-contributor, contributor, star, basically.
Right.
And seeing, does that correlate differently than out of state type of thing? Because I think that's a big part of the mystique too. But there are some things about this data as we got into it that doesn't surprise. I mean, obviously, the position that's offered the most out of the 155 guys, almost a third of them are offensive linemen.
Yep.
46 out of the 155 are offensive linemen, followed closely by defensive line at 32, and then linebacker. So half the guys are at the line of scrimmage or a step off it. There's only a dozen running backs in, 20 odd years, call it. I forget the exact number when I have to add 2003 and 2025. I think that's 23 years, right? So there's only a dozen running backs.
Yes.
There are only 8 defensive backs. And that includes, I should mention, if a guy was recruited as an athlete, I don't know if I said it before we hit the red button or not, but put the position they actually played. So not a lot of defensive backs in states were scholarship offered players, 10 wide receivers. So it plays into a lot of the stuff that you expect. The most highly rated position by average is also not that much of a surprise. Offensive line comes in just at an 87.9, so just under an 88. Like the average averages out at a high 3-star. Defensive line right behind that. And then obviously the lowest ranked one would be defensive back. And that was mostly going back. And that was a sub 3-star. That was a 79.8. So some things don't surprise.
All right. While we're doing that, though,
yeah,
I'm looking back over the list. The last defensive back that was offered in state was Hunter Wohler.
Yeah.
Okay. You have to go back before him. Although I'm scrolling down.
You do a lot of scrolling.
I know. I'm scrolling down. And Hunter Wohler was in the class of 21.
Mm-hmm.
I think it looks like Matt Hubley.
Yep.
Was the last one before him. So.
He was going to be a trivia question for you today. You just beat me to my trivia question. It was going to be, do you remember the last defensive back they offered in state? It was Matt Hubley. And he was a guy, concussions. So he was a washout.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he fits that mold. So
and even him too, if you look at this, I mean, he was ranked 13th in the state,
and
he was an 81.
Yeah.
So he was a borderline 3-star.
Yep.
Like borderline.
Very much so. So
wow.
When you pull all this together, like when you look at all this data, and then I took it and made my wife insane when I'm like, hey, what's the best way to pivot this? And what's the best way to pivot that? And what's like, because my wife works in Excel all day. She's better than me.
I would have asked my wife too, because to me, you go from intermediate to expert when you can do pivot tables.
I mean, you're stepping up.
I still can't.
Well, I was getting into VLOOKUPs, Max. I was very proud of myself.
Those two are the big stuff.
Yeah,
VLOOKUP people. Those are the big ones. Yep.
Like you walk around the office like a boss.
Yeah, absolutely.
When you can VLOOKUP.
Yeah. Totally.
Or when you walk over and someone's like, yeah, but you just gesture, you're like, that's a VLOOKUP. And you gesture with 2 fingers towards their monitor, and then you just walk away. And then they play Damn It Feels Good to Be a Gangster.
Totally. Yep.
And that's your life right there. So there are some conventional, let's say, conclusions out there that I think this data, you can argue, backs up, right? You can argue that, Alvarez. So again, just to keep in mind, we start in 2003, so we get the tail end of Alvarez. And then everybody since. With this.
Well, and we did make this point off air too. And I just, before we forget it,
yeah,
I can't imagine, stars and blogs and, the difference we talked about pre-2003. I can't imagine the difference in Alvarez's classes from 96 to 2003 had that much difference.
Yeah.
I can't believe there were. Anyway.
So you have this kind of conventional wisdom, which is that Barry Alvarez, Brett Bielema, and Paul Chryst built and held the wall in the state. They built the border, or they followed the Alvarez built it, and then Chryst and Bielema followed it. Like they enforced it and kept up with it. And to a large degree, that's true, because between the three of them, Alvarez got 75% of the players he offered in state, they committed. Bielema did even better. He got 86%. He offered 43 guys in state. He only missed on 7. And then Chryst was, again, right in line. He got 78%. So he offered 40 guys, he got 40 guys, offered on 51. So he only missed 11. So the three of them were all in the 70s. What's lost in there? Again, small sample size, but Gary Anderson hit 77% in state in 2 years. So he was right, more or less in line with Chryst, better than Alvarez, ironically, in that 2-year stretch. But those three guys kind of all follow the same pattern. Plus, I think with everything with Anderson is sample size. You'll never really, you can get whatever you want out of it.
No, but it still does make the point, sample size aside. I mean, I think the look back now is Anderson gets pilloried for destroying the relationship with the high school coaches. And you know what I mean? It like that's the reputation that he has,
Right.
and the data just
You
doesn't
don't
back it up.
see it.
No, you don't. It's small
Um,
sample size for sure, but I think he's unfairly pilloried
and then to argue more on that, building the wall,
for the
um,
data anyway.
Alvarez, Bielema, and Christ also more or less did the same thing when it came to recruiting those national level players in state. They got 2/3 of them. Alvarez got 4 out of 6. Bielema got 2 out of 3, and that's going to become important in a second. And Chris got 8 out of 15. So Chris was the worst. He got 61.5%. I mean, if you really want to get into the number, but they were all basically the same. And on top of that, what I think is interesting is looking at the top 5 players in the state. And again, this is where they all kind of correlate, these 3 guys. When it came to the recruits who were ranked 1 through 5 in the state, those guys did really well. Brett Bielema got 90% of them. He offered 30, which means if you do the math and he was there for as many years as he was there, he didn't offer 5 of them, right? Because there were 35 total, but there's 5 that he never offered. But of the guys he offered 30 of them. He got 27 of them to sign. Christ, he was around for 1 more year. He offered 35 guys. He got 27 as well. So he averaged 77%. Not quite as well as Bielema. And a lot of it was towards the tail end, which is where that argument about, oh, maybe he faded at the end was. But he still did very well. And then Alvarez was at 85%. So the 3 of them very much did well with the top of the talent in the state. So you could look at that and you say, see, there's my proof. Like, you can do that. You can say, yeah, there's my proof. But there are some parts to it that I think add context, that I think is really significant. The crazy thing with Alvarez and Bielema, throughout, if you put their tenures together from 2003 through the 2012 class, they averaged less than 1 national level recruit a year. They had 1 guy a year where they really had to put in work on average. So if you go back to 2003, you had 2 because you had Justin Ostrowski and Joe Thomas. But then you have years. Like 2004 had 2 and they missed on 1. That's that guy that went to Miami, Ryan.
Yeah, Ryan Anderson.
Ryan Anderson, thank you. 2005, they had 2. They hit 1 and they missed 1. But then there were none in 2006. And then none in 2008 or 2009. So they had years where they didn't have to worry about anybody. And most of the time, they were focused on just, there's 1 big recruiting battle we got to punch up on and hope for sort of the hometown discount, so to speak. But the rest of the time, you're battling with peer schools, and you're going to have a leg up in that fight, right? Like if it's Wisconsin versus Iowa, and the kid, knows Wisconsin by that time, it's been a decade that Wisconsin's been good at the very least.
Grew up wanting to be a Badger.
You've got the hometown discount there. So that's been there. That's what's really interesting is these guys really didn't have a ton of national recruiting battles. Christ, on the other hand, he had a lot more. He had almost double. He averaged 1.6 national recruits a year. And so what I think is interesting there is his success level is a touch behind those guys. He's at, as I said, 61%. He kept 8, he lost 5. Whereas Alvarez kept 4, lost 2. Is it a slight drop? Yeah. But so much of the drop is focused towards the end of when he was around. Like in 2022, they kept 2, lost 3. They had 5, right? And so much of it was backloaded for him.
Well, and I think that gets into your to the other thing we talked about too with grade inflation. Well, hold on though, because not just the grade inflation, but even Chris, we talked about it before. The last 3 classes that Chris had were the best ones ever.
Right.
Whether in state or out of state, they were the best ones ever.
And the backbone of having that is you had a depth in state that could bring it up, right?
Yeah.
But what I think is interesting is what's significant is you had guys who there are just more national recruits in the state now. So when you look at that, you say, again, you can be, hey, Alvarez, Christ, Bielema built the wall. You can make that point. Or if you want to say, well, there's more to it, you can also just turn and say, look at how many national recruits they had.
Yeah, and actually, while we're doing this, I don't want to stick on this, but so let's go over the national recruits in the Christ era.
Okay.
Okay, all right, 2015. I mean, that's the pseudo Christ era, right?
Yeah, but that's how we
had-
did it, right?
Yeah, no, I know, but he had to cut. There were no national recruits in that class anyway.
None.
Okay, even though out of the guys that were in that class, Robert Windsor, they didn't get him,
Nope.
but he was drafted. Zach Bond still playing in the NFL.
Yep.
He still starts, I think, too, doesn't he? I'm pretty sure. All right, next class is 2016. One national recruit, Ben
Yep.
Bredesen.
Yep.
He didn't want to go to Wisconsin, no matter who's the freaking coach.
Yep. They didn't get him.
Agreed?
Probably.
Okay.
Probably.
Next class, only national recruit there, Caden Lyles. I think that was a win for Chris. There were some connections.
Well, the father.
And he brought his brother in,
Yeah.
as well. So there's, think
There's
of it
family
that way.
ties. The father played for Wisconsin.
Yeah, right. Family ties. Tyler Beach,
Mm-hmm.
offensive lineman, but I think that one you can consider a win for a national recruit.
Yep.
Okay. Juan Harris, we've discussed him.
We've discussed him.
Again, I really don't remember that name at all. All right, next one.
2018 did
Julius?
not have one.
20. Yeah, I was just gonna say 2018 did not have one. Next one is 2019. Julius Davis.
Yep.
I
Which-
think that was a win.
People will be surprised at, but he had a Notre Dame, USC, and an LSU offer.
if you remembered it though, he was absolutely a national recruit, consensus 4-star. No, he was no question. Okay, but that you can count that as a
Yep.
win. But again, like with so many of them, he never worked out anyway. Okay, 2020 was Trey Wettig. I
Yep.
think you can consider that a win. I
Mhm.
also think Trey Wettig was one of those kids too that, I mean, he was born to be a Badger, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Well, the other thing that's, I think, notable in that one, which I think ties into some of it later on, but what's of note in that class, the second ranked guy in that class is Jack Nelson, who was a 95. He was a solid 4-star.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
he committed to Wisconsin very early, and then
Mhm.
that was just kind of it. People would call and he'd say, "No, I'm done."
No, and I think you could probably consider him a national recruit.
But he
too,
wasn't.
just
That's the
based on that.
interesting
Yeah,
thing.
I know.
Yeah.
Like I said, it's
Right.
subjective, right?
Right,
I mean,
right.
you could probably consider him one, but he's another one that he wasn't going anywhere else, no matter what.
Correct.
All right, so the next class is 2021. Hunter Wohler,
Mhm.
absolutely a win.
Yep.
Like that was a win for
Yep.
Christ. Braylon Allen was a defensive back. He wasn't a running back when he came in.
Right.
Right.
Mhm.
So, but I think you can consider that a win too. And that class had some dudes in it too. And then after that, you're into the 2022 class, and I think that's where a lot of this debate really starts. I think it's where a lot of this discussion really starts.
Exactly.
Where it seemed that like the wall started to be breached.
Correct.
Although I'd argue even there too. I mean, Jerry Cross, I don't know that he was going to UW anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the first one to commit out of that class, and he committed pretty early to Penn State. I don't know if he's played yet, by the way.
No.
I haven't seen
I looked him
field.
up.
Yeah. I don't, I would expect it to be, he would have been a starter by now. Billy Schroth, that's another one. It's a family connection kind of thing. I don't think he was ever going to UW, no matter what. And then Carson Hintzman, I think that's probably that's a loss. But
Right.
other than that, I mean, that was a pretty loaded class.
So that was
but-
the top 5 they made a big deal out of. Because
Yeah,
you had
it
Joe
was.
Brunner that Wisconsin
Yeah.
got. Then they lost Strouth, Hinsman, Jerry Cross, and the only one they got was Isaac Ham, who's never even enrolled. So,
No.
or
And
Ham.
Joe Brunner there's still plenty of potential there yet.
Mhm.
But even that class, there's no other class that even comes close to that for the bumper crop of national recruits.
Well,
And I just, what can you
24.
take from that? No, I know.
2024.
Okay, fine. Going forward, but
Yeah.
are we talking about, is there grade inflation then?
Perhaps. I mean, what's notable? The big thing, the big thing that jumps out to me as we get into this is 2023. Wisconsin made one offer in state. One. Nate White.
Yeah.
Nothing else. They
Yeah,
didn't
I
offer
thought
another
that's
guy.
fascinating.
Yeah, and I think that it was interesting. That really doesn't get discussed, but it is interesting because you followed that with 2024, which is all really kind of what sparked this originally. You had Nathan Roy, Garrett Sexton, Corey Smith, and Donovan Harbor all go somewhere else. 1, 2, 3, and 4 all went elsewhere. And then in 2025, you already had James Flanagan. I have him in here as the assumption that Owen Strebig is going because that's the talk.
That's the
Notre
consensus,
Dame.
yeah.
So the
yeah.
top two are going to Notre Dame, and the only one they're keeping is this Roski or Reski guy.
Yeah.
At number 3.
I don't think there's any other than Trey Poteet. There isn't any other national recruits in the class, right? In the in-state class. Yeah, I don't think there is any other one. Well, and again though, but I'd still go back to that other thing. There's no Flanagan was never coming to Wisconsin.
Probably not.
I mean, he's a Notre Dame kid. It's a family connect. He's not coming here.
So
to me, it's like a Ben Bredesen thing. That's not happening
for me. Yeah, what it does for me is say, all right, so you take that build the wall concept, you can believe it because there's data for it. But I also do think there is a context to it that you say, like what is this context? Because there's another truth you can believe that's kind of along those lines, which is Fickell isn't good at recruiting the state. Like you can make that argument right now. So, we were talking before. I didn't really put it in context because I was sort of burying the lead a little bit.
Yeah.
So Fickell has made 12 offers in the state. As you know the answer to this, but before you looked at it, what would have been your guess at the number of in-state guys that he got? Would it have been 70% of them?
Yeah, like a not the majority, like a solid majority.
Right.
Like yeah.
He's only got 5 out of 12. So 41%. So as we talked about before, the lowest one of the other coaches is Alvarez at 75%. Right? So there's a 35 point difference there. Bielema was at 86. Like there's a gap there. You could also argue that he's not good on the high level recruits either. This isn't a great recruiter who's just getting better players, you could argue, because there have been 7 national recruits since he's been the head coach. He's gotten one of them. Mind you, he's had, and you could say, okay, he's just bad at it. He is bad. 42% in state and 14% on the national recruits, whereas all the other guys are at 2/3.
And not just bad, but like way worse than Gary Anderson.
Gary Anderson had one national recruit. Yeah, so to your point, Gary Anderson had one national recruit. He got him. He was 1 for 1. He had 14 offers in the state. He had 18 offers in the state in 2 years, which is basically where Fickell is. Fickell's because it's going earlier now. They're kind of close.
Yeah.
He got 14 of them. He got 3/4 of them. Like Gary Anderson is not a statistical outlier to those other guys. Again, just the way you could make the argument, well, there's some context to the wall. It's totally cool if you want to make an argument about Gary Anderson. Well, he's not like the other ones. Make whatever argument you want. There is context to Gary Anderson if you want, right? But the thing that's interesting about Fickell that I would argue is no head coach has had this kind of concentration of national recruits. In 2 cycles, he has had 7 national recruits. In Brett Bielema's 7 years, right? He had 3 in-state national recruits. So I look at...
Well, and we went over the list of Christ ones.
Yeah. So, right? And so Christ had 13 in 8 years. Bielema and Alvarez had 9 combined. He has 7 already. So, like, there is definitely something different there. So, I am totally cool. If you want to say Fickell's bad at recruiting in state, I'm cool with you. Like, I'm legitimately, if somebody wants to make that argument, I'm like, okay, make it. Mm-hmm. If you want to argue, hey, there's context, which the context being he is dealing, like, he's fighting a multi-front war. Like, that would be the metaphor, right? This is a metaphor, Max? Is this an analogy?
I'm not so sure I like that metaphor on February 6th of 2024.
But
yes, it's a good
okay.
metaphor.
but my point is like I feel like the idea is that if they have one or two guys that you really got to go to the plate for,
Yeah,
there's Joe Thomas. I know they had to fight for back in the day, and Justin Ostrowski.
they had to fight for him too, as
They
I
had to
recall.
fight
Yeah.
for,
Mhm.
or even like what's the tight end? Travis Beckham. They had to really go to the plate to fight for him. They can do that if it's a guy or two. But Fickle, it's like I've got 4 fires to put out one year, and I got 3 fires. I think when you're fighting more than one, the likelihood that one of them is like, I don't really care about staying home goes up. B, it's going to divide your attention because I feel like, I feel like you could make that argument too, because you could certainly say, hey, it's not like I see a coach here in Luke Fickle who isn't interested in recruiting the state, because the moment he got the job, he was running around the state, visiting every high school, doing all that stuff, visiting coaches, yada, yada, yada. You heard from high school coaches. So if you want to, take that end of it, I'm totally fine with it. Like whatever, again, it's whatever you want to take from this, you can. You can take data, you can take nuance, you can take anecdotal, go for it. Because the unfortunate conclusion on this I draw is any one of these things it's totally unsatisfying, but any one of these things can be true if you really want it to. Go for it.
Yeah.
But I actually have some thoughts that I got to, like things that I am like an idea I am buying into with this. And one of them is what we were talking about is the grade inflation stuff. Like I don't think Wisconsin's classes in and of themselves are getting better. Like if you go back and you look at the average of the averages, I shouldn't say it's technically the average, it's the averages of the averages just because I did it quick on a spreadsheet, but it's within range. Since 2021, the average recruit rank of a player offered by Wisconsin is an 89.98. So almost a 4-star on average since 2021. So if you go 2021 through 2025, that includes a down year where it's just Nate White, right? Those are really good recruiting classes. If you go from 2016 to 2020, so, the next 5 years before that, the rating drops 2 points to 87.32, which is a lot. I mean, like 2 points is a lot in recruiting, right? Especially as we know,
definitely.
the grades compress up these days. So then you take the next step and you go back 2006 to 2010. And the average recruit ranking in there of the offered players is 85.78. So you've dropped 4 whole points from 21-25 to 2006-2010. Now, does that mean they're just like something happened and everybody got bigger, stronger, and faster and taller? No, I don't think that's the case. What do I think that's a case of? I think that's basically a signifier of the growth and the expansion of the recruiting industry and the ability for teams and players to connect with each other farther afield, right? It's way less, let me talk to the high school coach and he tells me who's good, and therefore the local guy has the leg up because that guy knows who his good players are. It's, I have huddle film now. I have national recruiting experts that work for these websites that travel around the country and look at guys. I think it's quite simply that. Like when you look at these numbers, it just tells you the story of recruiting as a practice, for the participants, but not just us as consumers, but like for the high school kids has changed, right? Because there are guys like Jack Ike Aguanu would not be what he was back then. I mean, we're using him. I'm not like hanging a signpost on him, but using him as an example. Like something tells me that guy had the measurables to be better than a 2-star recruit. It's just a function of, place and time and all that kind of thing.
Well, I like how you said practice. I mean, if practice, being a lawyer or a doctor, or it's like this mix between art and science. art, science, and judgment. So I'm glad that you said that, and I think you have to. I don't know how much more or how much more or less of an art recruiting is now or then,
Yeah.
and there may be more data now because you're looking at numbers that are, it's numbers. It's supposed to be like objectifying that to some level. And I mean, especially for Wisconsin, they've never been about like quote the stars,
Right.
the ratings. You know what I mean? It's fascinating. It's fascinating to
Well,
me.
it's funny. I feel like something that I thought would give me way more object, like make this a very much more simple objective exercise. I just feel like, oh, this is just like it's giving me a different way to add layers of nuance or to lay the nuance on top of the numbers because there's enough familiarity today. And maybe that's my own bias. Because the other thing is the thing that had me scratching my head a little bit is, to go back to Mr. Oops, to go back to Tom Oates' basic premise, which is, like when he was doing the Oops thing, it wasn't really to throw shade. He was trying to make the point like, hey, there's talent in the state and you need to get the talent in the state. And you say, well, why does he say that? Right. Or why does that? And it's not just Tom. I mean, this is a pretty widespread belief, obviously. Like, why is the idea of it's important to recruit the guys in the state exist? I mean, on some level, I think people from Wisconsin like when the players are from Wisconsin, right? There are some people who believe in that, right? That's great. And there's nothing wrong with that. But on another level, I think a lot of people would argue is that one, again, the talent exists, but two, the premise that you have a better chance of getting that talent and getting them to come to the school. And it's just easier to procure talent more efficiently. And I am starting to wonder, or I am wondering, maybe that is changing, right? Maybe it's just as easy to get, or just as likely to get Kevin Haywood, who, according to 24/7, is the number one recruit in the state of Pennsylvania, as it is to get Owing Strebig, right? Who looks like he's going to Notre Dame. Or maybe it's just as easy to go get a kid out of Illinois, right? I mean, I could pick up other names, but maybe that calculation isn't as valid. And it doesn't mean that I believe that, but it's like maybe there's something to that. Maybe the high-end kid who's a high 4-star kid in Wisconsin is not easy anymore. Do you not go for him? No. But maybe you don't look at them the same way you do other players. Because there is one last piece of this that like jumped out at me with flashing lights. That I was like, holy cow, this is crazy. And that's when you started looking at recruits by their rating and then breaking them down into tiers. And I kind of just started at the lowest, which was like, there's all these
Yeah.
kids who were in the 70s. And I'm like, I got to kind of put them all together. But I took every kid who was an 82 or lower and put them in a pile. And then I put every kid from 83 to 86, and I put them in a pile. And I should say under 83. Sorry, when I said 82, but you got the idea. So then I had the kids under 83. Then I had the kids 83 to 86. Then I put a pile of kids 86 to 89. And then 89, 92, 92, 95. And then everybody who was like high 4-star and up. Right? And you broke them down into those categories. The Badgers, do you know where they do the best? It's the kids who are 86 to 89, which is fascinating to me. That's also the most common sort of category that they offer. Out of 155 kids, there's 42 kids there. That's almost a third, right? If I'm doing the math right here, a little bit less. But those 42 kids they offered, they got 38 of them. They hit on 90% of them. And that is sort of like their sweet spot that I find interesting because kids slightly under that, the 83 to 86, they only get 76% of them. And the kids just a tier above that, 89 to 92, they only have gotten 65% of them. There only been 17 of them. So what does it tell me? It's those are the guys that are just under the radar for the national level guys, right? Like if you're Penn State unless a guy really jumps out at you, if he's like a high 3-star, something tells me you can get one of those in Pennsylvania or Ohio or New York State. Unless something about the kid's tape really jumps out at you, you don't need to go to Wisconsin. So what is Wisconsin doing there? They're fighting Illinois and Iowa and Minnesota and Purdue and Indiana. And chances are they're going to come out on top. And they can still fill a roster with those guys because most of those guys are not national. So they tend to be the guys who stay home and they form the core of the roster. They're offensive linemen, they're tight ends, they're, Connor Sheehy at defensive tackle or defensive end. They're sometimes an edge linebacker or an inside guy. They're a Derek Landish. That's where they, when Landish was lower, but that's the idea. But that is still always going to be valid. So when I look at in-state recruiting, the only thing I say, like, where are the alarm bells sound, is if they start having trouble getting those guys. Because they're going to go find 4-star guys around the country. I still believe that they're going to be able to do that. They need some easy wins in recruiting to fill a class, right? Because if you're taking 42 guys over, call it 20, you're averaging 2 kids a year like that. That's 2 easy wins. Like, that gets you a chunk of your class right there, right? That's 10% of your class. If you can get them early, like Michael Ruski, that's in this class, those are the ones you need to win. And as long as they're winning those, I think the in-state recruiting stuff, it's too early to tell anything for me, because I do think there is a change here. Because maybe it's like the official visit rule. Maybe it works both ways. Like, we always just said universal good for Wisconsin, net influx in of talent, which may still be true, but it works both ways for those kids. So to be determined. And the funny thing is, this all ties into, I was doing all this thing, and to circle back to where we started, where I stole our friend Andy's tweet for the idea. As as I've said on this show before, a lot of times, like, when I'm fleshing out ideas, he's my sounding board because I have no Wisconsin buddies to talk to, And so he's I'm like, hey, what do you think about this idea for the show? And he'll flesh something out. And after I had done all this, I was explaining some of my thoughts, and he sends me a link to one of his old This Week in Badgers newsletters where he talked about Alvarez's first class.
Oh, yeah.
And Alvarez's first class, where the big story was he flipped all these guys. You know who he didn't flip? The top 2 guys in the state who went to Notre Dame. So it's sort of like circle. I'm like,
where else? Notre Dame.
So yeah, this week's show, or this week's main topic, was all stolen for me. So sorry.
Do you remember who those guys were?
I'd have to look up some Flanagan was a name, Jim Flanagan or something.
I think he played for the Packers, actually.
I'll tell you in just 1 second.
I'm 99% sure.
Let me pull it up here.
It's not James Flanagan's dad, is it?
It might be. You never know. It's 1990.
I kind of think it is, actually, now that I think of it. Flanagan lives in Green Bay, right? He's from Green Bay. This tight end?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure it's the same guy.
It was Jim Flanagan and Greg McThomas.
Yeah. So Jim Flanagan turned out working out. Yeah, because the thing that stands out for me on this is, it's still talent acquisition, talent development, talent deployment.
Yep.
I mean, honestly, the thing that stood out the most is how many of these guys work out. I mean, I don't. There's that. Which is still, to me, recruiting is still more art than science, for one thing. But if you look at, there's just all of these, especially on the national recruits, there's so many special cases.
Yeah.
It's really hard to have apples to apples comparisons all up and down this board. It really is. And I thought it was a good point when you're talking about the 86 to 89s that make up the bulk of these classes.
Mm-hmm.
Wisconsin's got those from all over the country anyway. And the Anderson stuff is interesting because again, there's this perception that he wanted to go away from in-state and go national a little bit more, but his whole approach was different. It wasn't just, national versus in-state. I'm going to go. I mean, there was junior college. There was all kinds of second chances.
Mm-hmm.
And he put out, and what did he offer? Like 2.5x
Yeah.
over what either Bielema or Chris did. I mean, it's just such a different approach. So how much of a different approach is Fickle taking? Because I think Fickle is probably looking at a more national scope in terms of the net. Now, what's able to come in with the net? I don't think he's going to disregard or disrespect the state, and I think he's going to take the same or similar approach. But I mean, at the end of the day, as long as you're getting a national one every couple cycles,
Yep.
and again, the national ones there's so much special cases. There's just kids that are not going to go to Wisconsin. It has nothing to do with the level of the program or the interest or what they think of the program or blah, blah, blah. The national one's fine. I agree with you in terms of if they stop getting the 86s to 89s,
Right.
but that's not going to happen,
So it's
is
interesting.
it?
I don't
I mean,
think
and if they
so.
do, it's because they're not offering. They don't like. I just don't think you'll lose anything, even if that happens. And I think I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I don't know if there's still, and I think this is a fundamental fan base issue generationally in terms of alums from then to now, is this whole thing of, are we in the provinces or are we ready to make a step into the national, right?
Yeah.
I still go back. You and I think, but I don't know when I said this to you I don't know if it was last week or it wasn't when we were talking about this, but I still go back to that thing. There's nothing special about Clemson other than they spend money, and you can't say that UW doesn't spend money anymore. I mean, it's all Dabo, right? I mean, they went through how many coaches and spent the same amount of money or more?
You need a
I
generational
just
guy.
There's nothing
Yeah.
special about it. Is it? Oh, because it's in the South. I guess maybe I don't know. So if you're looking at it from that perspective, I think you really have to trust the process a little bit with Fickle. I mean, it's only his second year, and I don't think the recruiting has changed that much. I saw today on 24/7 like the top 25 classes for talent going into this National Signing Day, taking transfers and high school kids all together. Wisconsin's 24. I mean, isn't that where they should be?
Yeah.
All right. I mean, if we're gonna the data that we're using here is based on stars and offers, right? That 24 is based on stars and offers, right?
Correct.
So they're doing what they've been doing or better, but it's still, I don't know. I think the guys that Fickle's been able to get throughout his career have been 3 stars that have gone, that have blossomed into players,
Mm-hmm.
and it's still a developmental program. I just don't think there's anything that's lost. I just don't, and I think Fickle's just a younger guy that has a different outlook on things, and I don't know. I'm just not worried about it. I think that's the one thing about this that really stands out to me is, I Loyal Crawford's on this list as a regional recruit. I mean, how many Loyal Crawfords are on this list?
A lot.
It's tons of them.
Yep.
And I think they wash out or succeed at pretty much the same rate as no matter where you're coming from in the country. And the wall concept, I think, was good when you were trying to build the brand and trying to build it up. But I think that's done, isn't it?
I think the wall. Well, here's the thing. This is the question that I have: is the thing that I am watching, and I don't have an answer for it. Like, because I
I
don't think
I
we've
don't
seen
I
enough
don't
yet.
either. Yeah, I don't either. I like to throw out that provincial versus national thing because I think before it was provincial.
Yeah,
Clearly,
but
clearly.
but I guess the thing I am curious to see is if we see more similar classes. Is it more that the idea of the hometown discount in football for a high level guy is kind of the way it's going in basketball, right? Because like basketball, there's no such thing as in-state guys, right? I mean, as far as
No, I
it
don't
doesn't
think
really
there is.
work to the same
And
level.
and I think there's a lot of, especially in the UW fan base, there's a lot of crossover because these guys, no matter what, if you're a national recruit in the state of Wisconsin, they very rarely go to Wisconsin or
Right.
Marquette for that matter. So I think there's a lot of smarting that
Well,
that
so,
happens
but I mean
among the
that,
fan base. I don't know how much of that carries over.
but that's my point. Is what I'm saying is the nature of basketball recruiting seems different than football recruiting, and it feels like football
I think so.
recruiting, especially. I just think you have all these high level kids, right? And you just get the vibe that like some of them you get the vibe that pretty early on, 8th grade, ninth grade, they are identified and they start becoming almost like a product that is shopped. And it's way
No
more
question.
organized camps. It's way more, travel around the country. You now can, and if you don't have the economic resources to do it, now you can take official visits earlier. And now they're not going to cap them at 5 anymore if they don't want to, which is that's good for a kid who doesn't have a lot of resources. But what it does is it makes that, the proposition of I went and I looked at, state U down the road and that seems pretty nice. Like that's becoming less and less of the norm. And I am curious to watch over the next few years if like high level kids in Wisconsin continue to, hit sub 50%. Or hit at a significantly lower rate than the lower tier guys, and because it's easier to be a national recruit.
Sure.
The logical next step for me when I was thinking about this exercise, like when we went through all this data, was all right, where's a peer state, and do we see a similar trend in peer states with high? Because with all this data, that's the part that jumps out. It's that these national recruits over like the last 4 years, the hit rate has dropped. These high level guys, these 4-star plus guys that are getting bigger offers, the hit rate's dropping. Now, is that something that's happening in another state that's similar? But finding a state that's similar is really hard. My first thought was Iowa, but you have 2, FCS, have 2 Power 5 schools there. And then the other one is like, oh, maybe Nebraska, but Nebraska doesn't have the same number of recruit. Like it's a much smaller
It's a less populous state.
That's what I mean. Like it's a
Yeah.
less populous state, and you're like,
Yeah.
so where do I look? Like it's very hard. Like Minnesota doesn't really fit, and
Minnesota's probably close, but
the
Minnesota didn't have that. They didn't have that Wisconsin Iowa Renaissance yet.
that's kind of what I was thinking. Is like you don't
That's
have
probably the closest one though.
yeah. So it's like, is it worth doing it with those? Like that's the closest you can come up. Like it's trying to find a peer program to do it with that I was interested in. That was the 2 outgrowths for me. And the other thing wasn't directly tied to what we were talking about, but jumped out at me was the wash rate. I was just curious to see if the washout rate was the same, because I suspect it probably is.
Astounding. Oh, I suspect it is too.
A big part of the washout rate is injury. It's guys who have big injuries and then they just never can come back from it. And that's not going to matter where you're from. It's not
Who is the highest rated recruit on this whole thing?
Justin Ostrowski.
Right? He's the one that I always go back to.
Yeah. And that was exactly it. He has no knee. I mean, I saw this article because I looked him up and it's like, I have no cartilage in my knees. I can't jog. And you're like, oh God.
Yeah.
Like,
it was bad.
Yeah,
it was bad.
7-8 years ago.
Well, so here's one for you too. And I know this is going to take a while to play itself out. All right. This is all high school recruiting.
Yeah.
Okay. That's the transfer portal changes a lot.
It does.
And I know it changes a lot, So, I mean, all of this data that we've compiled, or if you look at it and, the washout rate and who has succeeded and who didn't, and injuries set that aside. I think that's probably a constant. But how much of this changes with all of that? And there's, you know what I mean? And especially with the transfer thing too, I thought Evan made one of the best points when we had him on, is with those, low FBS, FCS, Division 2, even Division 3 in, Forqueen's case. There's a level of economization there, isn't there? With NIL? Or, you know what I mean? They can only, it's going to be hard to analyze it just because that's a lot of change.
Well, we didn't even, it's funny. I was
For
talking
TV,
about
sure.
national recruiting and all that stuff, and I didn't even mention the NIL stuff, and that ties into it too. Like, we don't know
It
if
does.
that's playing into this. We don't.
Yeah,
Because it's so opaque.
no, you can't now. You can't now, and I mean, you can't compare it to what happened for the 20 years prior.
We don't know. Maybe we'll see if it changes behavior. Like, my point is,
I agree with that.
It's a new variable for sure, but do we know that the variable is changing behaviors yet? Or are we looking at simply Luke Fickell is bad at in-state recruiting? Like, we don't know. Like, that's the part that's interesting to me. Max, we just spent over an hour on this. We are not getting to poor Sam's question.
No. Well, we did have a little bit of a break for folks.
Well, no, but
behind the scenes, but we did spend. Yeah, we spent.
No, Max,
time.
I'm looking at the clock running, like the recording. Like, we are over an hour, sir. 66 minutes. After this is cut down, it'll be a little shorter. But we did a lot. Sam, we will get to you next week. We actually have a few more in the hopper. Plus, we get coach availability tomorrow and later in the week with Fickell and the new guys. So we will have enough for a show next week. If you have a question or a thought stirred by this conversation, let us know. If this was impossible to follow as well, let us know. But I'm going to put the visuals up on the Patreon page just so you can go look at them and just sort of see what we pulled together and what we were thinking. And I don't know, maybe I'll kick this back out into another Google sheet that people could poke around in.
If anything, too, it's a lot of food for thought.
Yeah,
it really is. It really is.
I think in the end, if there's a conclusion you want to draw or an inference, like I said, you're going to find a way. Like, there's data there that probably supports your conclusion, and that's okay. Like you said, recruiting is a bit of an art. I have a feeling looking at this stuff is a bit of an art too.
Absolutely.
And you can be a cubist or an impressionist, and both of those are equally valid.
Well, you said
is that
practice.
A metaphor or an analogy?
No. Now I'm racking the brain. But
all right.
No, I'm just glad you said practice, though. I mean, because it's you're a practitioner. It's not how much of it is science and how much of it is art. I think it's way more art than science, isn't it? And that'd be the conclusion that I take from it is, I think they do just fine. And I think at the end of the day, it's the results on the field. You're right. It's wins and losses, isn't it?
Well, but here's the thing. Here's what hangs over all of this. I think for people our age and younger, is there is a pretty strong consensus if Wisconsin is going to next level, because that's what everybody's thinking about. It's next level. I'm using those air quotes. The recruiting, the talent acquisition has to step up. Right? And losing the top guys in the state does not help it step up, because Christ's best classes were built on the backs of a really good in-state class, right? Even if they didn't work out, over time, if you kept getting classes like that, it's going to start working out eventually.
Sure.
That's a different story. Let's wrap this thing, man. We're never going to get out of here.
Sounds good. No,
we have probably melted people's brains. I hope this isn't too dense for everyone. Thank you for listening. Again, we'll be back next week. Just as a heads up, we will be off the week of President's Day, February 19th. I'm going on vacation, so I won't be around. So don't bother us. All right, until the next time, Max?
Yes, I'll still have my phone. But yes, until the next time.
I'm not answering.
Enjoy the conversation? Head on over to buckaroundpodcast.com to find all the ways to connect with the show, links to our Patreon page, and feeds for every major podcasting platform. We want to thank each and every one of our patrons. You make this podcast possible. This has been The Buck Around, Badger football analysis from a fan perspective.